Before we get into today's story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. And if what you're about to hear hits home, share this video with someone who might need it. Now, let's begin. When the gates of the Juvenile Reentry Center in Pueblo clanged shut behind me, the sound echoed in a way that made the cold Colorado air feel even sharper against my face. I stood there with a state-issued duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the same one they'd handed me when I was processed in 2 years earlier. Inside were clothes that didn't fit anymore, a cheap paperback I never finished, and the shoes I'd worn the night everything went wrong. It should have felt like freedom, like the start of something new. But instead, there was a hollowness spreading through my chest, the kind that made it difficult to breathe deeply. Maybe that emptiness was what you got when the system squeezed every ounce of certainty out of you. Or maybe it was what was left when you walked out into a world that had continued spinning without you. My release officer said something about resources and transition services, but her voice barely registered. The only thing I managed to repeat back was that I understood the rules of my probation and that I had to check in with a local office within 72 hours. She gave me a thin smile, the kind worn by people who do their job long after hope has slipped out of it. When she turned back toward the building, it felt like the last tether holding me in place had been cut. I walked toward the bus stop on the far side of the road, my shoes crunching on gravel. It was early morning, a haze floating low over the stretch of land around the facility. I had no real plan beyond getting as far away from the center as the bus route would take me. Before I could even sit down on the metal bench, my phone, which had been returned to me with a dead battery and no charger, buzzed unexpectedly. The number that flashed on the screen was one I didn't recognize, but something told me I needed to answer. The voice on the other end introduced herself as an attorney. Her words were formal, but the tone was gentle enough to make my stomach tighten. She told me her name was Karen Avery and that she had represented my grandmother for several years. She explained, with the kind of practiced care that comes from repeating a painful truth, that my grandmother had passed away a month earlier. I pressed my hand to my forehead and closed my eyes while the gray morning blurred into something shapeless. I hadn't spoken to my grandmother since the week before they took away most of our phone privileges. Even then, she had sounded tired, but determined. I had imagined she'd be there when I got out, even if she had to lean on her cane or catch her breath between sentences. I hadn't imagined silence. Karen continued, telling me there had already been a memorial service with a few neighbors and friends. My grandmother had left me her property, a modest piece of land near the mountains, tucked somewhere between Valsenburg and the Sangre de Cristo foothills. I was still trying to understand the idea of her being gone when the attorney added that the property had accumulated debt, unpaid taxes, penalties from the county for code violations, and several missed mortgage payments. The number she gave me was large enough that I struggled to attach it to anything real. For someone who had never had more than a few $100s at one time, the idea of thousands felt like a foreign language. The attorney said a development company had already reached out with interest in buying the land. They were expanding a network of vacation rentals and outdoor recreation lodges across southern Colorado. According to her, they wanted a quick sale and were offering enough to cover the debts and leave me with a small remainder. She spoke of practicality, of opportunities and stability, and part of me knew she meant well. Another part of me couldn't imagine what a person was supposed to do with such news on the same morning they got their freedom back. As soon as we ended the call, I boarded the bus and slumped into the back seat. The bus smelled like vinyl and yesterday's rain, the windows fogging each time someone breathed too close to the glass. I closed my eyes and tried to picture the land she had left me. Memories drifted back in hazy fragments summers when the grass grew tall around my knees. The sheepdog that followed me everywhere. The old shed where I used to sit and listen to my grandmother hum while she repaired harness straps. I hadn't been back since my early teens. After my parents died, life had gone blurry, and the world kept demanding things from us faster than we could give them. The bus rattled through Pueblo, leaving behind strip malls and gas stations until the world widened into stretches of winter fields. Frost clung to the fence posts, and the mountains rose in the distance like someone had carved them out of blue stone. There was something both comforting and overwhelming in seeing that horizon again. It reminded me of a life I wasn't sure I had any claim to anymore. While the miles rolled by, I kept replaying the attorney's words. Debts, violations, missed payments, an offer on the table. It all felt like a riddle that someone else should have been responsible for solving. My grandmother had always handled everything, every bill, every repair, every stubborn problem that came with living on land older than almost everyone in our family. I remembered her hands, calloused, steady, capable. I couldn't imagine how such hands could stop working or why she hadn't told me just how bad things had gotten. But maybe that was who she was, someone who carried more than she ever admitted. By the time I got off at a small town south of Colorado Springs, the bus driver gave me a look that asked whether I knew what I was doing. I wasn't sure that I did. I found a cheap motel and checked in with the few dollars I had left. Inside the room, the heater groaned like an old man trying to stand, and the mattress sagged enough to swallow me if I wasn't careful. But it was the first door I'd locked from the inside in 2 years, and that fragile sense of control felt like something sacred. The next morning, just after dawn turned the sky pale, I called Karen again from the motel lobby phone. I asked her what would happen if I chose not to sell. She explained the reality plainly. Foreclosure would begin in a matter of weeks unless the debts were addressed. She didn't pressure me either way, but she wanted me to understand the seriousness of the situation. She mentioned, almost hesitantly, that my grandmother had refused every offer from the developer before her health declined. When I asked why, the attorney said she didn't know, only that my grandmother had been steadfast in her decision. That was the moment I realized I couldn't make any choice without seeing the land. If my grandmother had been fighting for it so fiercely, there had to be something more to the story, something she hadn't shared. It didn't matter if the house was falling apart or if the land was worth more trouble than it was worth. I needed to stand there and see it with my own eyes. The attorney gave me the address and said she would meet me there the next day with documents and the key. After that call, I took a long breath and felt something shifting inside me. Not clarity, exactly, but a pull toward a place that still had my childhood footsteps pressed into its soil. It was a pull I didn't know I'd been waiting for. When I got a ride from a trucker heading south toward Trinidad, the mountains stood tall and unmoving in the distance, as though they'd been waiting too. Every bend in the road brought me closer to the past I had spent years running from, but also closer to whatever future I might have a chance to claim. The land we were approaching had shaped the people who raised me, and even if I didn't know what waited for me there, I knew I had to face it. The truck rumbled on, carrying me deeper into the foothills, and for the first time since walking out of the center, I felt something steady forming in my chest, something like resolve, something like the beginning of a story that finally belonged to me. The mountains had already begun catching the light when the truck left me at the turnoff leading toward the property. Thin ribbons of gold slid down their slopes, stretching over the fields and the distant tree lines as if the sun were carefully unveiling the landscape inch by inch. The air was colder here, sharper, filled with the kind of silence that comes only from wide-open land, untouched by traffic or towns. I walked the last stretch of road alone, the gravel crunching under my boots in a steady rhythm that gave me more time than I wanted to think about everything waiting for me at the end of the driveway. The debts, the abandoned buildings, the unanswered questions, and the memory of my grandmother that was suddenly everywhere and nowhere at once. I saw Karen's car before I saw the house. Her sedan sat at the foot of the long drive, frost forming delicate patterns across the windshield. She stepped out when she noticed me, waving in a friendly but tentative way, as though she was preparing herself for whatever emotions I might bring with me. I wasn't sure what expression I wore, but judging by the heaviness in my chest, it probably wasn't something easy to read. She greeted me with a calm professionalism, then, noticing the direction of my gaze, tipped her head toward the land stretching out behind her. Only then did I really see it. The property looked smaller than I remembered, and yet somehow more overwhelming. The fields were pale with winter, the grass lying flat and brittle, and the few cottonwoods near the creek had lost every leaf months ago. The house sat near the center of the property, its roof dipping in the middle, like it had grown tired of holding itself together. The porch railing leaned outward at an uncertain angle, and the windows along the front appeared clouded with dust and time. I felt something in my stomach twist, a mixture of nostalgia and grief and guilt that struck so suddenly I had to swallow hard to steady myself. Karen handed me the key as we started toward the porch. The metal was cold against my palm, colder than it had any right to be. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to put it in the lock. Images drifted through my mind. My grandmother standing on this very porch, waving me in for dinner. The smell of stew filling the entire house. Her voice drifting across the fields when she called for the dog at dusk. Part of me expected her to open the door before I reached for the knob, like she always had. But of course the house stayed still, silent in a way that pressed into my bones. When I finally turned the key, the door resisted at first, as though the cold had settled into the hinges. It opened with a sound like a heavy exhale, revealing a darkness tinged with the smell of dust and disuse. Karen clicked on a small flashlight, sweeping the beam across the living room. Sheets covered most of the furniture, draped like ghosts, frozen mid-movement. The wood-burning stove in the corner was half buried in ash, with several logs still stacked beside it as if someone had planned to return and never did. The curtains hung crooked over the windows, letting in thin threads of morning light that made everything appear suspended between past and present. We stepped inside together, our footsteps leaving faint impressions in the layer of dust coating the floorboards. I felt like an intruder in my own history, someone walking through a memory that didn't quite belong to her anymore. Karen explained softly that the utilities had been shut off months earlier, and the county had issued warnings about the state of the property. She pointed out the sagging ceiling in the hallway, the stain on the wall that suggested a long-term leak, the cracked window panes that had let in enough cold to freeze the pipes. I nodded, though I barely heard the words. The house felt too full of echoes. My grandmother's laughter, her steady footsteps in the kitchen, the hum of her voice when she talked to herself while writing grocery lists. We reached the kitchen, where dishes still sat in the sink. A mug rested on the counter, its rim stained with tea. It felt wrong, looking at all of it untouched, as if she were just in another room and would scold me for letting the cold in. A calendar hung beside the pantry door, still open to the month before she passed. Appointments were written in the shaky handwriting I remembered too well, each letter a reminder of how fragile she had become. There was even a note marking a date she had circled. Call M. I wondered if she had meant to call me, or if she had already tried and the call never reached me. By the time we reached her bedroom, I felt an ache deep in my chest that grew heavier with every step. The bed was perfectly made, the quilt tucked with the same precision she had taught me as a child. Her slippers lay beside the nightstand. A book rested atop it, open and face down, as if she had stopped reading only to close her eyes for a moment. The closet door was open just enough to reveal her neatly hung clothes, each wrapped with the familiar scent I associated with her lavender sachets she'd kept for as long as I could remember. I reached out and ran my hand across the quilt, the fabric cool beneath my fingertips. For a second, it felt like touching a memory that hadn't yet accepted it was supposed to belong to the past. Karen let me move through the room without interruption, giving me space to absorb everything at my own pace. When we finally drifted back to the living room, she set her briefcase on the coffee table and opened a folder filled with documents. She explained the debts again in more detail, outlining each overdue payment and the penalties that had accumulated. I tried to focus, but the words blurred into a haze of numbers and consequences. Every decision felt impossibly heavy, and every path seemed to lead toward something I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face. Then she mentioned something that pulled me out of that fog. She said my grandmother had left behind instructions, specifically a sealed letter intended for me alone. She had held on to it for 6 months, waiting for the moment I might come here in person. If I had chosen to sell the property without visiting, she would have respected my decision and never delivered the letter. But since I had come, since I had walked through these rooms and faced the weight of what remained, she believed I deserved to know more. Karen reached into her briefcase and handed me an envelope worn at the corners. My name was written across the front in my grandmother's handwriting, the looping letters unmistakable. My throat tightened instantly. I couldn't open it right away, not with Karen watching and the air in the house so thick with everything left unsaid. I slipped the envelope into my coat pocket, feeling its shape against my ribs like a heartbeat that wasn't mine. After that, we continued the walk through, though the house hardly needed more explanation. The structure was struggling under years of neglect. The back bedroom had water damage spreading across the ceiling like vines. The bathroom tiles were cracked, some missing entirely. The foundation had shifted enough that one wall bowed slightly inward. The entire place needed more money and labor than I could imagine providing. Karen spoke of practicality again, emphasizing that selling might free me from responsibilities I never asked for. But her tone shifted at the end, softening when she said she understood why letting go might be harder than it seemed. When we stepped outside, the air felt colder than before. I looked across the land that had belonged to my family for generations, stretching into the foothills where the early sunlight now painted everything in a way that made it seem almost peaceful. This place carried the stories of everyone who had lived here, even the ones I barely remembered. I felt the letter burning like a coal through the fabric of my jacket, the weight of it heavy enough to change the direction of my thoughts. Karen told me she'd leave me to look around on my own. She offered to meet me in a couple of days to discuss whatever decision I reached. Her car rumbled down the road until the sound finally faded, leaving me alone on the quiet porch. The wind moved through the dormant grass with a low whisper, and the house creaked behind me as if adjusting to the cold. Inside, away from the wind, I finally pulled the envelope from my pocket. My hands trembled as I opened it, and for a long time, I simply stared at the paper inside. When I read the first line, the pain was sudden and sharp, but the warmth beneath it was unmistakably hers. The letter explained things I had never known. The pressure my parents once felt to sell their part of the land. The argument that had pushed them toward the icy mountain road the night they died. The way the same development company had resurfaced over the years, offering money they claimed would help, but leaving fractures in their wake. My grandmother had fought them not because she was stubborn, but because she believed the land was the last real piece of our family's history. She wrote about the guilt she carried, the mistakes she believed she had made, and the fear that I might grow up resenting the place she had tried to preserve. Then she revealed something that made my breath catch. She had saved money quietly for years, cash from selling timber rights, odd jobs, and whatever else she could scrape together. She had hidden it in small parcels across the property, unsure whom she could trust, unsure how long she'd be able to protect it herself. She ended the letter by telling me she hoped the money would give me choice, something she feared I hadn't had enough of in my life. She didn't ask me to keep the land. She didn't insist on anything. All she asked was that I decide for myself, not out of fear or desperation, but out of understanding. When I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, I felt both lighter and heavier at once. The truth inside it filled some of the emptiness I had carried with me. But it also left me with the knowledge that every decision I made from this point on would be mine alone. The house groaned again in the wind, almost as if it were aware of the burden shifting. I walked outside and looked across the property once more. The sunlight had finally reached the far fence line, and the frost on the grass began to shimmer. The land felt fragile yet strong, abandoned yet full of echoes. It felt like a place holding out hope that someone might return to it with enough courage to try again. And for the first time since I stepped out of the re-entry center, I felt the faintest pull of belonging, a thread tugging at something deep inside me. What waited for me here was more than debt and decay. It was history. It was truth. And it was the beginning of a choice I had never expected to have. The quiet that settled over the land after Karen's car disappeared down the road felt different from the silence inside the house. Outdoors, the air carried movement, the low rustle of dry grass, the groan of an old fence post leaning under its own weight, the distant flap of a bird cutting across the pale sky. Even the mountains, towering and unmoving, seemed to breathe with the cold. Inside the house, however, every corner had been heavy with absence, as though time itself had paused the moment my grandmother's hands stopped tending the place. Standing now between the two, the letter tucked safely inside my coat, I felt suspended in a space that wasn't entirely past or present. My grandmother's words echoed through me, both grounding and unsettling. She had left me a truth I hadn't asked for, and a responsibility I had never expected. But she had also given me something else: choice, real choice, the kind I hadn't been offered since before the night that changed the trajectory of my life. I walked toward the well house first, not because it was closest, but because the memory of it had always stood out. Even as a child, I remembered the wooden structure leaning slightly toward the east, as if bowing in the direction of the rising sun. My grandmother used to say it had character, that it reminded her nothing on this land stayed perfectly straight for long. Snow had piled around it, gathering like drifted sand along the windward side. I kicked a path through the powder until I reached the small patch of level ground where the map in her letter said to dig. The soil was stubborn at first, frozen on the surface and unyielding beneath my shovel. Each thrust of metal against the earth rattled up through my arms, shaking my shoulders until my muscles burned. But as I chipped away at the icy crust, the ground slowly softened, giving way in damp clumps that released the smell of cold dirt and buried leaves. I paused every so often to straighten my back, letting the shovel rest while I studied the spot before me. Each inch I dug felt like peeling back layers of time, not years, maybe, but something deeper. Something that had settled into the land the same way snow settled into the corners of the porch and the seams between the stones lining the path to the barn. When the blade of the shovel struck something solid, the shock of it ran through my hands so sharply that I almost dropped the handle. I crouched down and brushed away the remaining dirt until the metal of the box emerged, its surface mottled with rust, but undeniably sturdy. For a moment, I didn't move. I simply stared at it, letting the reality sink in that my grandmother had done exactly what she said she did. She had hidden pieces of hope in places where no one else would think to look. When I finally lifted the box from the earth, it felt heavier than expected, not because of the weight inside, but because of the intent behind it. Opening the lid revealed stacks of bills, wrapped neatly in plastic. The sight of them hit me with a force I wasn't prepared for. I closed the box again quickly, as if the cold air might somehow change what I had seen. There was a note on top, short and careful, written in the same handwriting I had grown up seeing on grocery lists and recipe cards. First, use it wisely. The simplicity of it made my throat tighten. My grandmother's voice, her certainty, her love, all of it pressed through those 5 words in a way that left me motionless for a moment, the winter air stinging against my damp cheeks. Carrying the box back to the porch, I set it beside the door and wiped my hands against my jeans before heading toward the barn. The fence line stretched behind it like a tired spine, sagging in places where posts had shifted or cracked. Even from a distance, I could see the section she had described, the 3rd post from the corner. Snow piled unevenly along the fence, forming dips and ridges where the wind had sculpted it. My boots sank halfway with every step, forcing me to lift my knees high just to keep moving. I found myself talking softly under my breath, not to fill the silence, but because the rhythm of my own voice steadied me as I trudged forward. Reaching the post, I leaned my shoulder against it and caught my breath. The wood felt brittle beneath my coat, weathered from years of sun and storms. Part of me wondered how long it had stood here, guarding the land, with nothing more than a thin strip of barbed wire to show where one world ended and another began. The snow here was deeper than at the well house, and the ground beneath it had frozen more tightly. It took longer, far longer, to pierce the earth, and my arms soon screamed from the effort. But each shovel of soil I removed brought a sense of determination I hadn't expected. My grandmother had believed I would return. She had believed I would find this. That belief became a kind of warmth inside me, pushing me through the numbness settling into my fingers. An hour passed, maybe more, before the shovel struck metal again. I sank to my knees immediately, brushing away dirt with hands that shook from exhaustion and cold. The second box was slightly larger, its corners reinforced with strips of old-fashioned industrial tape. When I opened it, the stacks inside were arranged with a precision that made me smile despite myself. There was another note, second and third, for repairs and hope. I ran my thumb along the edge of the note before folding it carefully and placing it back inside. The sun had begun its slow descent by the time I carried the box back toward the house. Shadows stretched across the snow, lengthening with every passing minute. I set the second box beside the first and allowed myself to sit down on the porch steps. My entire body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of what was happening. I had come here expecting to stand among the ruins of a life that once held me. Instead, I had found the beginnings of something new, something my grandmother had quietly prepared long before I was ready to understand. But there was still one more location. The root cellar waited behind the house, halfway buried in the incline of a small hill. Approaching it felt like approaching the last chapter of a story, one that might hold answers I wasn't sure I wanted. The wooden door had warped at the hinges, making it difficult to pull open. When it finally gave way, it groaned loudly, echoing into the dark interior. The smell inside was musty and old, like vegetables long forgotten, and earth that had been holding secrets far longer than I had been alive. The map in the letter had been precise 4 steps inside, turned slightly left, loose stone near the back wall. I traced my fingers along the floor, feeling for the uneven edge described in my grandmother's note. The flashlight I carried illuminated the low ceiling and the thick dust coating every surface. When my fingers finally brushed the stone that shifted beneath my touch, relief washed through me. I pried it loose with effort, coughing when a puff of dirt rose up around it. Underneath was the 3rd box. This one was wrapped in canvas and sealed at the edges, as though my grandmother had taken special care to protect it from moisture. I lifted it gently, uncurling the canvas to reveal what lay inside. When the lid opened, the bills were there, just as she'd promised, but on top of them rested a photograph. I recognized it instantly. It showed me perched on my grandfather's shoulders, while my grandmother stood beside us, smiling in a way I rarely saw in later years. We were standing in front of the barn when the paint was still fresh and the boards weren't peeling away from time. I felt something inside me crack at the sight of it. I held the photo carefully, turning it over to read the words written on the back in my grandmother's familiar hand. This is who you come from. This is what we were before grief found us. Do not forget that joy lived here once, and it can live here again if you choose to fight for it. The message struck me harder than anything in the letter. It felt like she had reached across years, across the silence of her final days, across the distance that had grown between us without either of us wanting it, just to make sure I knew I had not been alone. That I did not come from brokenness. That there had been light and love and laughter long before any of us learned what it felt like to lose everything. I sat on the cold cellar floor with the box open beside me, the photograph resting in my lap. Tears slipped down my cheeks before I could stop them. All the grief I had swallowed during the call from Karen, all the guilt I had carried from the day they locked me away, all the anger I still felt toward the world for taking the people I loved, it rose in me like a tide. I pressed my hand to my face, letting myself break open in a way I hadn't allowed in years. The darkness of the cellar wrapped around me, but it didn't feel threatening. It felt like a place where it was safe to finally let go. When I finally stood, the tears had dried, leaving my skin tight and cold. I gathered the box, the canvas, and the photograph, carrying them back to the house. I placed the 3rd box beside the others and stepped back, looking at all of them lined up in a row. $47,000, enough to cover the debts, enough to keep the land, enough to repair the house, enough to survive the winter, enough to give me a choice. The house loomed behind me, weathered and worn, but somehow steadier now that I knew it held more than cracked walls and forgotten rooms. It held intention. It held love. It held the last efforts of a woman who believed in me even when she didn't have the strength to believe in much else. That night, I brought blankets from my grandmother's room and laid them across the bed she had kept perfectly made. The scent of lavender was still faint along the edges of the quilt. I curled into the warmth of it, feeling the house settle around me, groaning softly as the night temperature dropped. It should have felt unsettling to sleep in a place so old and cold and lonely, but instead it felt protective, as though my grandmother's presence lingered in the air just long enough to carry me into sleep. When morning came, light filtered through the cracked windows in soft strips, illuminating the dust motes drifting lazily through the room. I woke with a sense of clarity I hadn't felt in years. The decision I needed to make was no longer a looming shadow. It had settled into something firm inside me. I stood, walked to the kitchen, and reached for the landline phone, surprised when it actually worked after a quick adjustment to the old wiring box just outside the door. When Karen answered, I didn't hesitate. I told her I was keeping the land. She exhaled slowly, a sound that carried warmth and relief. She said she would notify the development company and begin gathering the documents I would need to settle the debts and reestablish ownership. After we ended the call, I stood at the window and watched the sunlight steadily brighten the fields. Everything still looked worn, fragile, and uncertain, but the fear had lifted. I had a direction now. I had work to do. The next weeks blurred together. I hired contractors to fix the roof before the next snowfall, paying them in cash that made some of them raise eyebrows but not ask questions. The foundation repair crew arrived 2 days later, shaking their heads at the state of the house but promising they could stabilize it. I learned how to repair window frames, how to seal drafts, how to clear the chimney properly, how to clean out the wood stove and coax it back to life. Each task felt overwhelming before I began. But once I started, each movement became easier than the last. As if the house appreciated the effort, the walls seemed to hold warmth longer, the floors creaked less angrily, and the porch steps no longer felt like they might collapse beneath my boots. I met people in town as the work continued. Some recognized my grandmother's name immediately, offering condolences and stories I had never heard. Bill, the rancher who owned the property just west of mine, talked about my grandfather's dedication to the land, about the way he had worked through snowstorms and heat waves alike. Sarah, who worked at the feed store, mentioned her son was looking for part-time work and could help me repair some of the outbuildings. Slowly, the isolated feeling I'd carried with me for so long began to loosen. And somewhere between the sound of hammering nails and the sight of the mountains shifting colors with the changing light, I realized I was doing more than repairing a house. I was rebuilding a life piece by piece, inch by inch, guided by the echo of my grandmother's belief that I was capable of more than the world had allowed me to be. Spring was still months away, but I could already imagine what the land might look like then, green returning to the fields, the creek running clear again, the porch warm beneath the early sun. For the first time, the future didn't feel like something that belonged to someone else. It felt like something I had been given the chance to build. The weeks that followed slipped into a rhythm I had never expected to find on this land, a rhythm built from equal parts exhaustion and a quiet, steady determination that seemed to grow stronger each day. Winter still clung stubbornly to the edges of the foothills, sending icy winds across the fields and layering new frost over the windows each morning. But something inside me had begun to thaw. After uncovering the last box in the root cellar and making my decision to stay, the fear that had once spread through me like a shadow had shifted into something else: resolve, maybe, or simply the understanding that rebuilding was the only direction worth moving toward. Every morning, I woke to the soft crack of the stove settling as it cooled, and every morning, I reminded myself that the day ahead would ask more of me than the one before. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel defeated by that thought. I felt driven. The contractors I'd hired started early each day, their trucks crunching down the driveway before the sun lifted fully over the mountains. They moved with practiced familiarity, measuring the sagging roofline, marking the foundation cracks, peeling back warped boards, and replacing them with new ones. They didn't ask many questions beyond what was necessary. though a few of them exchanged curious glances at the sight of me working alongside them, hauling debris or steadying boards while they nailed them into place. I could see the silent calculations in their eyes, wondering how a girl my age ended up alone on a piece of land like this, with a house half collapsed and a determination that didn't quite match her frame. But they didn't press, and I didn't offer explanations. It was enough that they worked hard and treated the property with respect. That alone felt like a small blessing. In the afternoons, after the workers left, I continued the chores I had begun carving out for myself. Clearing snow from the walkway, sweeping the porch, gathering firewood and stacking it near the stove. I repaired what I could, even the small things that seemed trivial, securing loose cabinet doors, patching small cracks with the materials the crew left behind, oiling the hinges that shrieked each time I opened certain doors. There was something grounding about these tasks. They didn't feel like chores forced upon me, as duties had inside the correctional center. They felt voluntary, chosen, each one a step toward reclaiming a place that had been allowed to fall deeper into neglect than anyone realized. What surprised me the most was how quickly people from the nearby town began to weave themselves into my days. The first was Bill, the old rancher whose property bordered mine. He stopped by one morning, leaning against the fence as I shoveled a path toward the barn. His hat was pulled low, his breath rising in small clouds. He introduced himself with a nod, though he didn't seem to expect me to recognize his name. I remembered him vaguely from childhood gatherings, a man with a voice as steady as the mountains behind us. He told me he'd heard I was fixing up the place and thought I might need advice on a few things, especially once the thaw came. He wasn't pushy, but there was something reassuring in the way he spoke, a quiet confidence born from decades of working this kind of land. A few days later, I met Sarah at the feed store in town. I had gone in searching for something to treat mold in one of the storage sheds, and she recognized my last name before I even finished asking for help. She'd known my grandmother well, more than I ever realized, and she talked about her with a warmth that made me blink back a sudden surprising sting in my eyes. She mentioned her son, Tyler, who had been looking for part-time work since coming back from college. He had experience with carpentry and basic farm labor, and she thought he might be willing to lend a hand. I agreed almost immediately. The list of repairs I still needed to get through stretched far longer than my capability, and I wasn't too proud to accept help. Something the younger version of myself might have struggled with. Tyler came by the next day, tall and quiet, carrying a toolbox and wearing an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he was walking into. But he was polite and competent, fixing a jammed door frame in less than 20 minutes and offering to return whenever I needed him. His presence didn't fill the silence the way my grandmother's once had, nor did it erase the sense of being alone on such a broad stretch of land. But the support mattered, even in small gestures. It reminded me that I wasn't rebuilding in a vacuum. A community, a real one, not the rigid, rule-bound environment of the reentry center, was slowly folding itself around me. Still, despite the help, the property demanded more work than any one person could reasonably accomplish in a single winter. There were nights when I stood at the window, looking out across the fields as darkness crept over them, and felt the familiar prickle of uncertainty in my chest. The house was warmer now, but still drafty. The roof no longer sagged dangerously, but the interior walls showed the scars of years of neglect. The land itself was weary, the soil compacted from seasons of improper tending. Sometimes, the magnitude of it all pressed so heavily on me that I found myself gripping the edge of the countertop just to stay grounded. But then, I would remember the boxes hidden beneath the earth, the notes my grandmother had left me, the photograph of a family that had once stood under a brighter sky. And each time the doubts rose, they were quieted by that memory. The knowledge that she had believed I could do this, even when I doubted it myself. By late February, the repairs had transformed the house into something that felt less like a relic and more like a place capable of sheltering a life again. The roof no longer groaned under the wind. The stove kept the air warm enough that I could sleep without layering myself in blankets. The windows, newly sealed, let in light without letting the cold bite at my skin. Each improvement, no matter how small, felt like a step toward resurrecting not only the house, but something inside me as well. That transformation extended beyond the walls. I began envisioning spring in a way I hadn't before, not as a vague idea, but as a concrete season that would demand planning. Bill told me which grasses grew best in the soil here, which fencing materials lasted longest against the wind, which parts of the property drained well after heavy snowmelt. I took notes. I imagined repairing the old vegetable garden, planting seeds in rows where the ground had last been tended by my grandmother's hands. I imagined chickens in the shed behind the barn, their warmth filling the air with life I hadn't heard in years. I imagined learning how to mend the land properly, rather than simply struggling against it. The more I imagined, the more real those possibilities felt. One evening, after Tyler finished repairing a broken section of the porch railing, he paused before leaving and asked if I ever thought about getting livestock again. The question surprised me. I hadn't let myself think that far ahead, but he mentioned that Bill had said my grandfather once ran a small cattle herd, not a large one, just enough to keep the land alive and the family fed. Something about that stuck with me. The idea of running cattle felt intimidating, too big for someone still learning how to keep the stove burning. And yet it also felt like part of the land's story that might one day be worth continuing. The weeks blended into one another as the repairs continued. Townspeople began greeting me by name when I stopped in for lumber or supplies. Someone left a pie on my porch one night with a note welcoming me back home, even though I hadn't lived here in years. Another person dropped off a stack of old ranching manuals. These gestures, however small, stitched themselves into the edges of my days, slowly forming something that resembled belonging. I found myself smiling more often, sometimes without noticing. I spoke more. I breathed more deeply. But the moment that clarified the significance of everything I had been working toward came unexpectedly, on a day that might have slipped by unnoticed, if not for what it represented. It was early March, still winter according to the calendar, but the air held the faintest hint of something warming beneath the cold. I had been splitting firewood near the barn when I realized the date, and I stopped mid-swing. It would have been my grandmother's 74th birthday. The weight of that realization settled over me like the first heavy snowfall of the season, quiet and complete. I carried an armful of firewood to the porch and set it beside the door before sitting down on the steps. The mountains were beginning to glow as the sun lowered, turning the edges of the landscape soft and welcoming. A light breeze swept across the fields, carrying the scent of earth that had begun, just barely, to loosen after months of frost. I watched the shadows stretch across the land and felt something shift inside me, something like gratitude, something like acceptance. I thought of my grandmother standing where I sat now, morning after morning, watching the world unfold with a steadiness I had never fully appreciated. I thought of the years she had spent trying to hold this place together alone, the fear she must have carried with each unpaid bill, the loneliness of facing decline without help. I thought of the letter she had written, the effort she had taken to hide enough money for me to have a chance at something beyond foreclosure. I wondered how often she had sat here watching the same sky, hoping not for rescue, but for a future she would never get to see. For the first time since coming here, I realized the land no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a promise, one I had chosen to honor. And in choosing it, I had begun choosing myself. That evening, as the sun finally disappeared behind the mountain ridge, I whispered a quiet thank you into the empty air, not expecting an answer, but feeling the weight of her presence just the same. The cold began to settle in again, urging me back inside. The house, warm from the fire I had tended since morning, welcomed me with a familiarity that surprised me. It felt like a home, not the kind you inherit by legal right, but the kind you earn through effort, through struggle, through a willingness to believe that broken things can be made whole again. The months ahead would bring new challenges. Spring would test the land. Summer would demand long hours and hard work. There would be days when doubt returned, days when repairs failed, or the money ran thin, or loneliness pressed too tightly against the ribs. But the foundation of what mattered had been laid here, in this house, on this land, with these people who had begun, little by little, to welcome me back into a world I thought I had lost. As I settled into bed that night, listening to the quiet creak of the house settling into sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because I knew what the future would look like, but because I finally understood that I had the strength to shape it myself. I wasn't the girl defined by her mistakes anymore, nor the one trapped inside a system that refused to see her truth. I was someone new, someone capable of rebuilding walls and mending fences, someone learning how to trust the land beneath her feet. When sleep finally took me, it carried with it a sense of belonging, the kind that comes not from possessing a place, but from allowing yourself to be held by it. And as the night deepened around the house, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. The land had waited. My grandmother had believed. And now, at last, I believe too. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. I've got more stories, more lessons, and more journeys on the way. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, share the video with them. You never know who it might help. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.